Okay, so as promised, I'm going to walk you through the analysis essay packet just to make sure that all of the directions are clear because I know that there's a lot of things to read in this packet. There's a lot of guidelines and a lot of instructions. So maybe hearing it will help clarify the expectations. So you will be writing two analysis essays this semester, and these essays are very different than the close readings that you've done in a way. The main difference is that these are longer and that they have to be written from an objective third person point of view. Each essay will be in response to one of the 10 prompts that's on the second page of this packet. And I'll be guiding you through the whole process. Everything that you need is in this packet. So the first analysis essay is due at the end of week 8. The second analysis essay is due at the end of week 10. And there are some other helpful resources on Brightspace. If you would like some guidance with grammar or proofreading techniques, look look on Brightspace under the analysis essays module, and you'll find those resources there. So for the requirements, you'll be responding to one of the prompt options for each essay. So just assume you're going to be doing this twice. So I'm going to walk you through it, and you'll do the same thing at week 8 and the same thing at week 10. So you'll pick a prompt from the next page, and then you'll write a 4 to 5 page paper. My advice to you here is to let the content of your paper determine the length of your essay. So what I mean by that is your job is to respond to the prompt question. If you can do it in 4 pages, great. If you need 5 pages, maybe going on to a couple lines on a 6th page, that's fine as well too. So the 4 to 5 pages, just a reference guide recommendation. It should not be less than 4 pages. So if it's 3.5 pages, that does not satisfy this requirement. You will not get a passing grade on the essay. So if you're struggling with how to develop your ideas, feel free to stop by and see me. But if you follow the steps in this packet, you should have no problem meeting that 4-page requirement. The next bullet point here is that each essay should have a clear, defendable assertion. So another way to say that is a thesis statement. And that thesis statement, which is 1 sentence, should respond to the prompt question. So unlike the close readings where you're only talking about one poem, in this case, you're answering a prompt question and using the poems to help you answer that question. So if you want to think of it as the 2 poems that are a part of each prompt are like research, like as if you were using an article or some other kind of document for research purposes. I want you to think of it that way. So you're not explaining the poems, but instead you're using the poems as a means to support your thesis. Each essay should contain evidence from both of the poems listed in the prompt, and evidence includes quotes and paraphrases. So paraphrasing means to put it in your own words, to describe something that happened or something about the poem without citing the exact words used by the poet. Evidence should be logically organized and clearly defined body paragraphs. So in this packet, I'm going to help you better understand how to divide your ideas into functioning body paragraphs. And they should be driven by talking points. All right. And that those talking points are going to help you make decisions about the type of way that you'll organize and like organize your paper, including what types of transitional expressions you'll use and what your topic sentences will sound like. So here's some do nots. Do not discuss the poems separately. So although there are 2 poems listed in each prompt, you are not simply saying in this poem this happens and in this poem that happens. That's not what this assignment is. If you do that, it will be an F paper. Definitely it will be 5 points or less depending on the rest of the writing. So if you feel like you have to summarize what the poem is about, the place to do that will be in the introduction. And I'll explain that in just a few minutes. But just to be very clear, you are not expected to explain each poem in its entirety. You're not expected to explain the poems at all. Instead, you're using the text, which by text I mean the poems, to address the question that's in the prompt. Okay, so all you need are the parts of the poem that answer that question. Analysis essays are objective. So what objective means is it's the opposite of subjective. So instead of talking about your thoughts, your feelings, connections that you've made, things that you thought about while reading, any kind of connotative responses that you had, save that for our class discussions. In this paper, you are simply talking about the poem, the speaker or speakers in the poem, the elements of the poem. So everything is third person objective. Of course, the information that you're writing is your, opinion, or it's your ideas. It's your analysis, your critique of the poem. But the way that you're using the text and the type of information you're sharing about it is objective. So the whole thing should be written in third person objective point of view. That means you're not using I or we or us or you. You're not saying one or readers. So this is what I mean by like not being subjective. You're not going to describe how readers react when they see the poem. You're not going to talk about whether the poem was good or not. This is not the place to give the poet accolades and say, oh, Sylvia Plath wrote this fantastic poem. That's subjective. That's biased content, right? We don't need any of that in this type of paper. So simply just focus on what's there. It's kind of like we've been doing in class during some of our discussions. We do a mix of both things that you should be doing in the paper and things that you shouldn't be. So hopefully you can understand the difference between the two. And if not, just ask. MLA guidelines should be used. So MLA stands for Modern Language Association. And because this is a literature class, we use MLA in other disciplines like sociology or psychology. You might be asked to use APA guidelines. These are just basically formatting guidelines that help people in various disciplines speak sort of the same formatting language, so that if you read a paper that's in MLA guidelines, everybody uses the same structure, so everybody knows exactly what the in-text citations should look like, where to find certain things. The only difference is that you're not going to have a works cited page. So traditionally an MLA paper would include a works cited page, but for various reasons, which I'll explain later, I am not, that should not be done for this essay, okay? We will practice doing citations when you do the case study and get into more research and various types of texts. So you might have articles of criticism and photos and video interviews and poems and books, etc. Here we're just using the poems that are in this packet. So you technically, there really isn't, there isn't a book. I haven't given you like online references for where these poems were found. So we're just going to refer to the lines in in-text citations and practice that part of MLA. And then you can practice the other part of the MLA when we get into the case study assignment. So both analysis essays will not have a works cited page. You do want to make sure that you proofread carefully. So correct grammar and proper writing, academic writing that's appropriate for an academic setting is the expectation. Being eligible for English 101 is a requirement of this class. So the expectation is that you're writing at the college level. So again, if you need some assistance with this, or if this is a weakness for you, use the resources that I've given you, come to my office hours, visit the tutoring center through the virtual student services. Or, there are a lot of places to get help. So just let me know if you're struggling with that and I'll be happy to point you in the right direction. Also, last thing here is to show off. So this is your chance now to put everything that you've learned in the last, half of the semester to use. So use the terms, the bolded terms from Myers text, all the skills that we've learned for, analyzing and understanding and, writing about and speaking about poems. So words like stanza, line, the speaker, okay, things like that you're going to use, and the various elements, metaphor, simile, etc. When appropriate, right? So if those are a part of your response to the prompt, then by all means, feel free to use some of those terms. Some of the prompts are going to be, you'll be asked for specific terms. So we'll get to that in a second. And then, so these essays are graded on this 10-point scale, which is here, this rubric. This is how you'll be graded so that you understand where those points are. You will be submitting these on Brightspace. So there's an electronic version of this on Brightspace. And I'll be checking off each of the criterion, to describe how you performed in each category. And then you'll also get some feedback in each section as well as embedded in the paper, just like usual. So those due dates are here as well. So they're both 10 points each. However, analysis 1 is worth 10% of your final course grade, and analysis 2 is worth 15% of your final course grade. The due dates are listed there. I'm asking that they be turned in by 5 p.m. Friday of each of those weeks to allow me to grade them over the weekend. Especially the first one is super important because, as I mentioned today, I would like to count it towards the midterm grade, which gets turned in week 9. So I need to be able to, get them and read them and grade them with a quick turnaround. Also, because you'll need that feedback, if you look at this is week 8, 2 weeks later, you have the second one. I'd like you to be able to read the feedback from this to be able to do better on this one, which is worth more. It's worth 15% of your final grade. However, I will accept papers late, but not more than 1 week late. All right. So after the Friday of week 9 and after the Friday of week 11, I will no longer accept those 2 papers. All right. So this, I think, speaks for itself. I'm checking all the things that I just told you where the criteria are listed here, that there should be a thesis, that the introduction and conclusion are equally strong, that your ideas are organized, your transitions are used effectively, paragraph breaks make sense, you've fully explained and developed and supported your thesis in the body paragraphs, and that the textual support goes beyond the obvious and predictable. Some of you have a habit of writing things like obviously or clearly, but if something is obvious or clear, then that's not analysis, right? Like, so either don't use that phrase because maybe it's inaccurate, or if it's something that is really obvious, then don't write about it because we don't need that. And these analysis papers are looking for your unique response to the prompt question and what you're getting out of the poem. All right. Every quote and paraphrase, anytime you're referencing the text at all, you need to have an in-text citation. And so there's a whole page dedicated to explaining that, and so that you know what goes in those parentheses. I'm also giving you the technique, oops, this should say iced, the iced tea technique. I added the D because that's I used to call it the ICE technique, but I feel like ICE has turned into a negative, it has a negative connotation to do with immigration. And so I changed it to the D. Plus it works now with my iced tea and burger formula that I'll go through over in just a few minutes. So there's a long story attached to that. But anyway, make sure that you're integrating the quotes. You're not just plopping them in the paragraph, right? So you want to make sure that it's embedded within your own writing. And so you never want to start or end a paragraph with a quote, for example. And then this category also pertains to the MLA page formatting guidelines. So everything to do with MLA is here. And then the overall readability. So if the errors are so excessive that it gets in the way of understanding the paper, then you start to lose points in this category. But if for the most part it's easy to read and it's mostly for the, correct, then you can get 2 points. It's not that it has to be perfect. If you have a fragment or a couple misspelled words or something, like, you can still get a 2. But if, as I said, if there's a ton of mistakes, or every period to period has an issue, then, this category is, you can quickly decline here. So make sure that you proofread carefully. All right. And the scale is there, 9 or 10 is an A, 8 is a B, and so on. All right, finally, the prompts. Okay, so each prompt is attached to a theme, and each prompt has 2 poems that you're asked to use. So remember, you have to do both poems. And no, before you ask, you cannot substitute different poems. And no, you cannot write about just one of them. Okay, so in order to pass the paper, you do want to follow all of these guidelines. And there should be enough variety in these 10 topics that hopefully there's at least one that, well, 2, because you'll be writing 2 papers, that you're interested in. So I'm going to go over each of these. This is your chance now to, as I go through each topic, I'm going to kind of pause to give you like advice about if you're choosing this topic when appropriate. All right. So the first one is expectations about love. That's your theme. All right. So remember, the prompt is going to be associated with that. Using Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress and Sharon Olds' poem Last Night, what expectations do the poems suggest people have about love? All right. Now, in the past, I used to phrase this question as men and women, but it would turn into the sexist paper that was like totally focused on traditional gender stereotypes, like men want sex and women want whatever. Like, I don't want that paper, right? But some of that is in the 2 poems. So I want you to think about, not in a sexist way, but in general, there's more than one person. So there's the speaker in each poem, but there's also the person who they're with. So based on those 2 poems, what do they suggest that people in general expect when it comes to love? All right, that's what the question is asking you. So as you read each poems, you're reading the poems not for everything that they say in the poem, but what they specifically say about expectations about love. Okay. Failed love. So the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is really long, but it has a lot of answers to this question. So, choose carefully. If you wind up choosing this one, just know it's a really long poem, but in a way it's good because there's a lot to say about it. So using T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and Sharon Olds' Sex Without Love, why does love fail in these poems? All right. When you're thinking, you might have to think about this one a little bit, like, what does that even mean, right? What does it mean for love to fail? That's something you're going to have to decide as you read the poems. Part of answering the question is also defining the terms of, you might find that it's not failure, but there is some failure aspects of love doesn't happen in these 2 poems. And so the question is, why? All right, why are the 2 speakers struggling, or maybe not, it's not a struggle at all, but why is love not happening, okay, in those 2 poems? And again, I'm happy to help you. I have the answers. So if you're struggling with, there's more. I'm curious to see what you have to say. I have some reasons that I see in these 2 poems of why love fails, but you might see different reasons. So I kind of don't want to make you biased. I would prefer for you to formulate your own opinions. But if you need any help working through the poems, by all means, feel free to stop by and talk to me during office hours or appointment. Okay. Number 3, love and writing. You use William Shakespeare's Sonnet 130 and Harriet Mullen's Dim Lady. We've already discussed one of these poems. So how does each speaker portray positive images through negatives? And note that Mullen's poem. It's a prose poem, and it's a modern version of Shakespeare's sonnet. So it's not a parody, but it is um, a modern version. So she has taken that sonnet and has written her own version of it, but you'll see that they're very similar. Uh, and it's interesting. You might note that one is a prose poem, one is a sonnet, and like see if that makes any difference in how they achieve their message, right? But the main question is, how do these poems wind up being positive? How are they expressing a positive idea through negative statements or negatives, right? However you want to, whatever you see as negative. And sorry, this section is going to be long, so hopefully you're bearing with me with this video, but all right, I'm already boring myself. No, I'm just kidding. All right. All right, love and longing, number 4. So the difference between love and longing for love, right? Use Ellen Bass's Gate C22 and Denise Duhamel's How I Will End, which we discussed in class. We didn't discuss Gate C22 yet. But what is the role of the observer and the effect or effects of observing love? And I put love in italics because what's being observed you may or may not see it as love. It's some kind of affection or situation between a couple, I guess, of people. And I have in parentheses a little tip of think about the limitations that observers have. We talked about this with How It Will End, the fact that when you're observing someone else, the distance between you and who you're observing. So can you actually hear them, hear what they're saying? Do you know the people, right? So if you're just a voyeur, right, you're on the outside looking at someone, how do those limitations affect both what's being observed, but the effect of that observation? And think about like the role imagination in a way plays as you're observing someone else, this idea of like filling in the story that you think is happening, but it may or may not be true because you don't know the people. Kind of like in How It Will End when we talked about projection, and how they observed someone else arguing, but in the end, it brought up all of their own arguments. All right, so if you're taking this one on, I would kind of make a column of the role of the observer, right? Like what is the job? What is happening? What is the observer doing? What's the effect of watching? What's being watched and who's watching, right? I would make those columns and then see if you can come up with a thesis statement. All right. Oh, and that's the same for the others too. Like, for example, in here, you'd make the list for each poem, you would list why love is failing in each one, and then see, are there anything that they have in common? Are they failing for the same reasons, for different reasons? And this will help you write a thesis statement. So there's a lot of planning for these essays. There's a lot of thinking and pre-work, pre-writing, all the annotation, all the thinking, and marking up your poems and looking up words. All that stuff has to happen way before you even write, just to help you get to a thesis statement. So they take some time, and I hope that you'll use the 2 weeks that you have, or for this first one you have 10 days. I hope that you'll use your time effectively to do the work. And it shouldn't take you, give yourself some limits. It shouldn't be like 10 days worth of work, but it's something that will take a few hours, I would say. So, all right, number 5, death of a father. So I have 3 death topics: death of a father, death of a young person, death of animals. All right, so for the father, you're using Andrew Hudgens' Elegy for My Father Who Is Not Dead, and Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Night. And we read that one, the second one. As a matter of fact, isn't it called That Good Night? It might be called Do Not Go Gentle into That. In the poem, he says good night, but I don't know why the title there is night. If it's good night, correct me. Um, we'll find out in a minute because the poems are at the bottom of this packet. The prompt question is, what conflicting attitudes towards death are expressed in these poems? And in the parentheses, I'm always giving you like little hints or tips. So consider what is known about both of the fathers and both of the speakers. So in this case, they're both sons talking about fathers dying, but as the title tells you in Andrew Hudgens' poem, his father is not dead, but it's still an elegy. So think about that. And you already know Dylan Thomas's poem is a villanelle. Whether or not you talk about the form, you might bring that up and how the form it helps achieve expressing those conflicting attitudes. But the focus of your paper should be what the conflict is. All right. So between the sons and fathers, what's the problem with death or the views of death? Okay. And I love this topic. So if you need help with this one, I'm really happy to help. I guess I can give you this tip in the video if you're watching, if you're listening. In Elegy for My Father Who Is Not Dead, the tension comes from religion. So pay attention to that. The son and the father have very different ideas about what death means and what happens when you die. In Dylan Thomas's poem, as we already talked about, there's this problem with how the father is dying because the father is a man, and Dylan Thomas believes men should die a certain way. And so there's this idea of like, not necessarily machismo, but like there's this like masculinity being threatened or something by his passive death. And so that's a tip about what those conflicts are. And so hopefully that will help you formulate some kind of thesis to say about these two poems. For 6, Death of a Young Person, and each of these I think we've talked about one. So use A.E. Hausman's To an Athlete Dying Young and Ben Johnson's On My First Son, which we just talked about today. On My First Son is an elegy poem too. How does each poem avoid or use, or both, right, sentimentality in its description of a young person who has died? My tip is to remember to look up the word sentimentality. You can go back to Myers chapter 1. In Myers chapter 1, I have it in front of me. I can tell you what page to go to. He defines sentimentality. It's not a good thing. So it's a negative term. It's on page 32, which I'm not sure what page of the PDF it is, but it's in chapter 1. Sentimentality exploits the reader by inducing responses that exceed what the situation warrants. Okay, so it's a pejorative term. It's not the same as sentiment. It's not the same as emotional, right? It's kind of like unsubstantial amount of or excessive amount of emotional response, I guess. Okay, so you can decide, do the poems do that? Do they not do that? Is there an attempt to not do it, but they do it anyway? So read the 2 poems carefully and really think about if sentimentality is at play or not. And if so, you might think why, and if not, why. So ruminate about it a little bit, right? Like marinate that thought and read the 2 poems really carefully, thinking about specifically that concept. And the fact that the people who are dying are young, and if that has anything to do with that response. All right, of course it does, right? Okay, so 7, Death of Animals. So if you're not in the mood to talk about death, skip 5, 6, and 7. We had a few about love. We have, happy love and failing love. A lot of different topics here. But Death of Animals, using John Updike's Dog's Death and David Shoemate's Shooting the Horse. How do these poems treat the death of an animal? My tip is to consider how blunt the titles are and the effect that those titles have on reading the poem, right? So, not that you're going to talk about your, uh, how do I say this? So, it's not that you're talking about how the titles made you feel, but I want you to think about why why both of those titles are blunt, and how that is a part of, I guess, the treatment of the death of an animal. Okay. So the question is how? How do they treat the death of an animal? So your responses, your thesis would be giving ways that the death is treated. Okay. Number 8, poetry. Use Ruth Foreman's "Poetry Should Ride the Bus" and Billy Collins' "Introduction to Poetry," which we did on the first day or second day, I don't know, of class. Um, and the question is, what do the speakers say about poetry? So of all 10 of these, I would say this one is like the most vague of the prompts, but it's intentional because I guess it's hard to ask I don't what it's hard to ask a question without giving the answer. But basically, I want you to think about the intended audience. So we talked about Billy Collins. The speaker is sounds like a professor who's teaching an introduction to poetry class, and the they he's referring to are his students. Um, in Ruth Foreman's poem, think about who is her audience. Who is she telling that poetry should ride the bus, and what does that mean, right? Um, Billy Collins gives advice to students about what to do with poetry, and Foreman is also giving advice to a certain set of to a certain audience about what poetry should do. So that's what I mean by what do they say about poetry? What should poetry be? What should poetry do? What should other people do to poetry? So think of all those questions and try to, again, make these lists, annotate the poems, really think about what they have in common, what they have in what kind of, not that they have to have the same, it's not a comparison and contrast paper. None of these are, but in a way, all of them are, because you're finding talking points and then you're discussing how both poems, what that talking point has to do with both poems. And so in some cases, they might be saying the same thing, and in some cases, they might be saying a different thing, but it's all on that same talking point. All right. For 9, education and identity, use Marilyn Nelson's "How I Discovered Poetry" and Judy Heidsman's in the long poem, right? The long titled poem, "The Schoolroom on the Second Floor of the Knitting Mill," which we discussed. That's the one where Judy's not a good leader and the teacher's arms hang like sausages. So read those 2 poems again. And the question is, how did these educational experiences affect the speakers? Okay. And see if they had similar effects or different effects, but both are educational experiences that impacted these, poets or speakers in the poems. All right. Last one. All right. Food and sexuality. And we actually discussed both of these poems. So using Sally Croft's "Home Baked Bread" and Diane Lockwood's "Linguini," which we all loved both of those poems. What do these poems say about the impact food has, or foods have, on relationships? Okay, so think about the relationships. And, relationship, remember, that's a broad term. So do with it what you will, but there are 2 relationships, one in each poem. And what impact does food have on those relationships? Okay. So, tips. Follow these 10 steps and you will have a successful analysis essay. All right, I'm starting to get my loopy, tired energies kicking in. All right, so 10 steps. Start early. Like I said, select the prompt that you want to work with, do a close reading of the poems, and annotate the heck out of them. Make sure that you understand those poems before you begin your paper. Once you understand the 2 poems very well, look at the prompt question again. Start to think about how the poems answer this question. Explore all possibilities. Okay. Really explore all possibilities. Write your thesis statement, create an outline, and plan how you will support that thesis and where your evidence is and how you'll organize that evidence, right? Then draft your essay. So type it up. Create an interesting, unique title. Take a break and then revise your paper. I didn't write take a break, but I'm going to tell you, take a break between drafting and revising. There's 2 steps, revising and editing. When you revise, you're checking for the parts, the organization, and the development, meaning the content. What's there? How is it arranged? Do you have everything you need? So make decisions. Sorry. Make decisions about I lost my train of thought. Oh, what to add, what to move, and what to remove during this phase of correction. And then edit your paper. So proofread from start to finish to find grammatical errors, typos, spelling mistakes, any kind of formatting issues, everything, right? So proofreading is small scale, revising is big. Revising is looking at the parts. Do I have an intro? Do I have a conclusion? Is everything developed? Do I have enough talking points? Did I use enough support? You know, all those bigger questions. Proofreading is more like, where are my mistakes? You know, did I spell everything correctly? Please make sure that you spell the poets and the poem titles, poets' names and poem titles correctly. Never refer to a poet by their first name. Either use the full name or only the last name. But remember, this is a respect issue, and it's not just for poets, but all authors and people in general. Unless you know them on a first name basis, never use the first name. And this is also the time where you would get a chance to notice maybe awkward phrasing, or if you use the same word a lot. This is your chance to do those final tweaks and improve the overall phrasing and writing in your paper. And sorry. So what follows here now in the next part is information for what should go in each section. So understanding the 3 parts of your paper. One second, please. I can't pause this. Or if I can, I don't know how to pause the recording. So, okay. So introduction, body, conclusion. In the intro, remember, this is the first paragraph that your readers see. And you want to ease into that topic. So your readers don't know. So imagine, you know, your reader, it's me, obviously, but like, imagine that it's not me. Okay. So like you're writing to an audience who doesn't know the poems, you're writing to an audience who doesn't know the topic and doesn't know how you feel about it. All right. So, or what you think about it. So you kind of have to gently ease into the topic. You can introduce the poems. You can, you might mention the poets if there's anything that's relevant. When you're using the poem titles, you want to make sure you use quotation marks around the titles and use the capitalization as it appears in the poem for those titles as well. And like it says here, unless the poems have otherwise, it should be standard capitalization for titles. Do not italicize poem titles. Okay, we'll get to that later, but in MLA, other things get italicized, like books, journal names, stuff like that, film names. Poem titles are like article titles. They get quotation marks around them. This is a good place. So I have here, if you feel compelled to summarize, but actually it's a good introduction technique to give a brief, like 1 to 2 sentence summary of the poem. It would happen here in the introduction. So get that out of the way and let us know what the poem is about and who the speaker is, or anything that we need to know before we really dive into your support and your thesis statement. Do not begin to analyze the poems here. Therefore, your intro should not contain any citations, not quotes, not paraphrases from the poems. All right. And then again, this is a reminder to be objective and use 3rd person point of view. Set that tone and that viewpoint off right from the bat and keep it consistent throughout the whole paper. In the body section of your paper, which is normally 4 to 6 paragraphs, actually, well, yeah, I mean, it can be 3, but usually it's 4, 5, or 6 body paragraphs, depending on how many points you want to make. Okay. So in this body section of your paper, um, you should be, so minimum is 3, but it's normally 4 to 6 paragraphs. You should provide objective support for your thesis. So this is why, beforehand, if you're following my steps and creating that outline, you'll be fine. Find those talking points. Let those talking points drive the where those paragraphs get broken and how you transition to your, what your topic sentences say and what transition words you use. Your thesis and support should match the prompt question. For example, if you're asked why love fails, you should show how or why love fails in both poems. Divide your body paragraphs according to the outline that you made, right, and your response. These choices that you make ahead of time can help you determine the length, like we mentioned before, if it's going to be a 4 or 5 page paper. And in the body paragraphs is where you're going to cite or paraphrase lines from the poem that support these ideas. All right, so show us where the evidence is. The conclusion, this is always the hardest, I think, paragraph for people to write. Usually you're just so over it all that it winds up being like very brief, but it shouldn't be brief. It should be well developed. It should conclude, give the final thoughts on this topic. And you're not bringing in any new information here. You're also not repeating exactly what you said, but you are kind of recapping it. All right. So when you give a recap, you're reminding us of the main idea, right? Your thesis and the points that you made without repeating the exact same sentences. Okay. And again, the whole thing should be third person objective point of view. This page helps you write that thesis. So what does a thesis look like? It should not be narrow. It should not be broad. It should be just right. And this makes me think of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? I have this umbrella analogy that if it's raining outside, you want to make sure that you grab an umbrella that's going to fit you and keep you dry. But you don't want to pick one that's so big that you're going to bump into people on the sidewalk. You don't want that little cocktail umbrella that came in your drink or your pina colada or whatever the night before. That's not going to keep you dry either. So make sure that your thesis statements should not be a fact. It should not be an announcement. So none of this in this paper I will, or this paper will explore. None of that, right? It also shouldn't just be a fact like traveling through the dark and dog's death both use metaphors. Great, that's true. That's not a thesis statement. Okay, so your thesis statement has to be a claim that can be supported by the rest of the paper. They are your opinions based on textual analysis. All right, so remember that your thesis statement controls the whole essay. And then, so I gave you one example of a too narrow, and I gave you one example of one that's too broad. Saying something like, Sonnet 130 and Since Feelings is First are both similar and different. That's like a throwaway statement. Okay, it's so broad. Great, they're both similar and different. You've told me nothing in this sentence. Okay, so make sure that you use very specific, if you want to show that they're similar and different, but like say what's similar, say what's different. So here are some better ones. And some of these are, all of these actually are on topics that are no longer associated with this class. And I have 2 student sample papers, and both of them are available to you on Brightspace, and they are also on topics that I no longer use. Although dog's death is still used, I don't pair it with traveling through the dark anymore. So one of the sample papers has that one. The other sample paper has 2 poems, and the prompt question was something like, how does technology impact love, or something like that. And so you can read the 2 student examples to get some ideas of how to structure your paper. Please note that the student sample papers are not flawless. They probably have some grammatical errors or some, issues in their paper, but they're both strong papers. And they both have various strengths, like maybe it's the introduction technique or the transitions used or citing the text properly. So both of them have strong points. But if you locate an error or you see something that's not so great, again, they're students, so it's not going to be necessarily publishable perfect papers. But I believe both of the ones that I gave you as examples, I believe both of those papers earned an A. All right, so just to give you that kind of framework. So thesis statements are something like William Stafford's poem Traveling Through the Dark and John Updike's poem Dog's Death avoid sentimentality while treating the death of an animal with compassion, respect, and love. All right, so we can see one paragraph will be about how they avoided sentimentality. We'll see that there's going to be a section about how both of the animals' death was treated with compassion, one about respect, and one about how it was with love. I wish I need to bring this topic back. This was my favorite. Through the use of narration, metaphor, and tone, Jane Kenyon's The Shirt and Susan Minot's My Husband's Back communicate a lustful longing for their beloved. So this one's going to focus on the elements. All right. Jane Kenyon captures desire with wordplay and brevity in The Shirt, while Susan Minot describes an intimate bond through metaphor and narration in My Husband's Back. All right. So it's going to contrast the two poems. And each poem, they have, it looks like 2 talking points. All right. So to me, when I read this thesis statement, there's going to be 4 body paragraphs. It's very clear what the topic is, right? And these are strong thesis statements. So, the first one gives you that traditional XYZ, what I call an XYZ thesis statement, where the points are listed. They're actually in a list in the thesis statement. And these other 2 give hints at the topics without necessarily, they kind of do too. So through the use of narration, metaphor, and tone. So we already know this lustful longing will be described in 3 categories. Okay. All right. The moment you've been waiting for. And it was so stupid earlier today. Okay, so this is iced tea, right? Like the drink and the wrapper iced tea. And then these are ice cubes, but the ice cubes are ice cube. So if you don't know who these people are, you're not going to appreciate this, but we all know what a burger is. We all know what iced tea, the drink, is. And so if you remember burgers and iced tea, hopefully it will help you remember how to structure your body paragraphs. All right, so this burger represents each body paragraph. So a body paragraph should have a topic sentence. It should have stackable evidence, right? And each piece of evidence is iced. Okay. And then an analysis, the bottom bun is what ties it all together. So integrating text support can be tricky. So I'm giving you some signal phrases here for how do you move, what is the evidence? How do you move from point to point? If we use like this as an example, the death of an animal is treated with compassion, for example. So you might have, both poems treat the death of the animals with compassion. That's a topic sentence. In this poem, this happens. In that poem, that happens. You would stack that evidence. So you can have things like, for example, for instance, according to the speaker, or this is clear when the speaker says. An example of this is when. This is evident when the speaker says. This is illustrated by. All right. Any of these kind of signal phrases helps clue us into what that evidence is what the evidence is showing. So the iced is explained here. Introduce, cite, explain, develop. So for every quote and paraphrase, all right. Except you're not citing the yes, sorry. Yes, sorry. For both quotes and paraphrases, you want to ice it, meaning some people call it a quote sandwich, all right. But you're never just dumping the quote in there. So for the purpose of this handout, the introduce part or introduction has been underlined so you can see what I mean. Sometimes it's a signal phrase, sometimes it's a whole sentence, all right? So this is evident when the speaker says, quote, bringing our eyes up to regard the sanctuary, okay? And then that would be explained later, the explain part. The citing part is this, and the quotations. Notice how there's a backslash to show the line breaks. It can be a whole sentence. This contrast is suggested several times in the poem. For example, the speaker says that Coral is far more red than her lips red. All right, line 2. The speaker reveals that she became a mirror and she is fleshless. Here you'll note the brackets. What's happening here is the pronoun is being changed to fit the paper. So there might be times where you need to change an I to a he or she when it's appropriate. So if you feel the need to change it, use those brackets, okay? You could also say the speaker says, I became a mirror, and then keep it exactly as it is. All right, so each one of these is showing something different. Basically, I'm trying to show you where the line breaks are. When the poet's name is not in the sentence, it's a part of the parenthetical citation. And what else? Backslashes, the brackets, everything is explained here. Okay, so to cite it, you want to make sure you have quotation marks. Be sure to open and close them. Make sure that everything that's in between the 2 quotation marks is exactly as it appears in the poem. If it's misspelled, if it has a space, you're going to do exactly what's in there. Okay. Now, you're typing it straight across, so you're not hitting enter when there's a line break. That's where the backslashes come into play. So that when I'm reading this, I know that this is line 54 and this is line 55, okay? Avoid quoting too much at one time. If the quote is longer than 3 full lines of your typed paper, you need to follow the rules for a block quote, but this is strongly discouraged. I strongly discourage it for 2 reasons. One, sometimes students do it because they think it's going to make the paper longer, but it doesn't. It's painfully obvious. A lot of times the formatting is wrong and there's all this extra space. Remember, I'm looking at ideas, not just the length of your paper. So if you hit enter 5 times and you get it to a 5th page, but there's really 3 pages of content there, you're not fooling me, right? But also, what happens when you quote too much at once is when you go to do the explanation part, you wind up having to repeat the quote again. So use it in little chunks, quote as needed at the time that you're explaining it. So once you introduce it, you cite it, then you're going to explain it in your own words. And this is really how you get that development going. This is how you get those longer papers. So maybe sometimes explaining the quote in your own words or what it means. And also explain also means, how does that quote show the point that you're making? So don't assume that the readers know why it's there. Like, for example, if you're quoting a metaphor, but you didn't tell us that it's a metaphor, don't expect us to make that connection, right? It's your job to explain how that either quote or paraphrase is saying or doing what you think it is. All right. And so then developing the paragraph by explaining how that textual evidence you've included supports the point you're making in the paragraph. So that's the analysis part 2 here is where you tie the evidence to the topic sentence, make it clear. And this is usually 1, maybe 2 sentences. Okay. The MLA citations are all here. This is boring, but it's, really important. So the Times New Roman, the 1-inch margins, everything double spaced. You need a header in the upper right-hand corner with your last name and the page number. You need a heading in the upper left-hand corner of the first page only. Do not put my name. All right. You need your name. You need the course, the semester, the assignment name. So analysis SA1 or analysis SA2, the date, either the date you're turning it in or the due date is fine. And then again, for the purpose of this class, no works cited page. If you don't know how to do this or you're struggling with it, watch my video on Brightspace. There's a YouTube link to how to do it. Okay. The in-text citations, we just went over above the up here. This cite part explains all this, but here it goes into a little bit more detail. So according to the guidelines, there's 2 rules for citing poems. We're going to use the second rule because none of the poems that we have are separated by parts and stanzas. So we don't have to worry about this like part 1.12 lines 258. You know, ours are not that complicated. We have short poems. So use this one, which is the word lines and then the number or numbers. And then if the poet's name is not in the sentence, the poet's name as well. So like Thomas, lines 3, blah, blah, blah. If you keep talking about the same poem for a few sentences, you can just, the subsequent, after the first time that you're quoting it, the subsequent ones can just have the number. You don't even have to rewrite the word line or lines. So each of these in gray is giving you the scenario, and then below it is the example. All right. And I'm highlighting here. I like colors maybe bring attention to these points, but whenever you're paraphrasing or putting it in your own words, directly citing, meaning that you have a quotation, or otherwise refer to the line of poetry. Sometimes you might refer to just a word, right? That's fine. If you have the word in quotation marks, put the line number in the parentheses right after it. All right, so for the most part, it's going to appear right after the quote. And usually that's at the end of the sentence. So you'll notice there's no period here. The period goes here after your parentheses. But if you're not finished, let's say the sun believes blank, right? This part and something else, then you would just continue on and blah, blah, blah. But this number 2 still goes right after the closed quotation marks. You don't wait till the end of that sentence. All right, it should always stay close to the text itself. Hopefully that's clear. And then now we're getting close to the end. Yay. My suggested outlines. I'm giving you 2 versions. They're pretty much the same thing, right? So, I mean, they're almost identical, but they're slightly different. So you can see which one matches your like style better. And unfortunately, because I made this packet based off of a PDF that I had to do this as like a screenshot. So you can recreate it. I might, if I have time this weekend, I might create like writable files that you can write into. But this part, this is for you. This is the outline is like you can do it on a piece of scratch paper with a pen, and that's most likely like what you'll do. It's giving you this like visual map for what to write. So on Brightspace, one of the resources that I've given you for writing is a chapter called Arrangement. It's a chapter from a 101 textbook called Patterns for Writers. And in that chapter, they review introduction strategies, how to organize body paragraphs, how to write a thesis statement, how to write a topic sentence, strategies for conclusions. So if you need those tips, go to that packet and just skim it, or read it carefully, like whatever you need. All of the stuff is there. There are many strategies for writing academic papers. Not all of them will fit this assignment, so keep that in mind. But I have introduction strategy here because you need to employ some strategy to ease into the topic, the subject. Now, don't get too lofty, all right? My advice is you can use the quotation, like a famous quote device. You can use the background information, which I think everybody will do by giving a brief summary of each poem. If there's some other kind of background, like context that's needed, historical reference, or I don't know, something about the poet that's needed or the time period, um, by all means, you can do that as well in the introduction. Um, Definition of terms, like if you're writing on sentimentality or even failed love, deciding what those terms mean in the introduction is a good strategy as well. But some of the other strategies, like a fact or statistic, or if you've written one-on-one papers, you know what I'm talking about. There's like 8 different strategies. The rest of them really don't work for this, because remember, this paper is an analysis of 2 specific poems. It's not about why love fails in general. It's not about what people expect out of love. Like, you're not looking up, advice columns or psychology textbooks. It's really just about these 2 poems and what you think, they why you think love fails in those poems. It's not a research paper. So don't waste time, both your time but also the time of the reader, by writing it or having to read all these things that have nothing to do with the poems. So you want to get to your topic as fast as possible. um so like, and what I mean by that is, like, sometimes people spend a lot of time talking about, like, let's say you pick the animal's death one. Like if you had something like, many people love their pets, and pets become like family members, and when a pet dies, it's devastating, and all like blah blah blah. And so, like, all of a sudden we have like 10 sentences that are generic, general, have nothing to do with the poems, right? So like maybe 1 or 2 sentences of that is okay if it works, but it's really like, your best bet is to kind of introduce that theme, get right to a summary of the 2 poems, and then hit us with that thesis statement, right? Like, answer that prompt question. And then I have 4 here, but again, the body paragraph, the number of body paragraphs really depends on your thesis and what what points you want to make and how you're going to divide it. But in any case, for each of your talking points, you need support. Whether it's quotes or paraphrases, you need support from both poems. And this outline is giving you a chance or a line for that bottom bun. So what is the connection between the quotes and your thesis? All right. This one is the same thing, but it's just laid out a little bit differently. It's reminding you to do an iced technique for each poem. And I didn't write the analysis line here, but basically, I mean, obviously you would close off that burger, close off that burger, right? How many burgers and iced teas will your paper have? Checklist. So once you get finished, like, you're never finished, right? But once you think you're finished, come back to this checklist. You can physically check it off, like, yep, I did that. Yep, I did that. That's going to be so satisfying when you have all of these X's. It's going to feel so good. But just, make sure that before you click the check mark that you've actually done each of these things. So we're looking at the MLA formatting, the content and organization, and the correctness. Okay. Now the poems. All right, and that's it. So the only thing I'm going to say here is, so what I try to do, what I did is I gave you the topic. So if you pick topic 1, here are the 2 poems for topic 1. All right, and I even gave you all the line numbers, so it's easy to reference. For topic 2, the love song of Jafar Prufrock is just too long. Like, it's like 5 pages long. So what I decided to do is I posted the link here where you can listen and read it. But I am also going to share with you the, I have to do this still and I forgot. I will post the PDF, like picture, or I'm going to take pictures and scan it as PDF of my book. And so you'll also get my the annotations that I have. So that will help you, because it is a long poem and I don't mind sharing that, the different things that I noted or underlined or pointed out might help you make some decisions about why love fails in this poem. And then the Sex Without Love is here. The two poems for 3 are here. And because this is a prose poem, there are no lines. So if you decide to do this one, for every time you quote or reference Mullen's poem, you just have to write Mullen in parentheses. All right. So my advice to you is then in your sentences, instead of saying Mullen, you might just say in dim lady, or the speaker says, that way you're not saying like according to Mullen's poem, blah, 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 Mullen, right? Like, but either way, it's not wrong if you do that. It's just an advice. But because, yeah, there's no page numbers, that would be the in-text citations. No line numbers, not page numbers, sorry. You would just use Mullen there. All right, topic 4, the 2 poems are here. And sorry to do this, but like where I could, I try to fit both poems on the same page. But this one, if I hit this on a new page, it would have taken another page anyway. So I decided to just move it up so that they're next to each other. And then Duhamel's poem ends here. All right. Death of a Father. Oh, I didn't even put the topic number. See, I mean, I knew there were going to be typos. This is what happens. This is topic number 5. That's the second thing I've corrected, right? I'll go in and change the file. All right, those are for 5. This is for 6. These 2 poems for 7, they are both on the same page. For 8, they each had to get their own page because this one was a little bit long. For 9, those 2 poems fit on the same page. And then for 10, they each have their own page. All right, and that's it. So if you need any support, I swear to you, I don't mind. Come to my office hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 12:30 to 3:30, Wednesdays, 2 to 3. And if needed, I can see you outside of those times. So just send me an email, give me some options of when you're available. And if I'm available at the same time, I'm happy to meet with you. And remember, my office hours are on a different Zoom than the class Zoom. So just click on that virtual office and services and you'll find that information there. Happy writing. All right, good luck.